영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 1. An Urgent Message. The ancient fortress stood on a craggy, windswept ridge on the western slope of Mount Mystery. Miles of dense, shadowy forest guarded by fearsome creatures separated it from the rest of Magica. Most people had forgotten the fortress was even there. But to those who remembered, it was a reminder of the old times, when Magica was not the peaceful place it was now. A gaunt man with glittering amber eyes stood at a high window staring down at the forest. He heard a grunt and turned to see that a troll had entered.
What is it?
The man demanded. The troll grunted again. A puff of magic energy rose above him, showing a rough image of ugly troll teeth tearing into food. Hungry. The trolls were hungry.
You'll have to wait a little longer,
The man said.
but soon you'll have all the food you want.
He stepped over to the contraption in the center of the room. He'd finished building it moments ago. It was a mishmash of many things: dragon bones and scales, leather-bound books, stones gathered from the cave of the unknown, and more. At the very top of the pile was an ancient human skull bleached white by time. The man rubbed his hands together and placed them over the skull's eye sockets. The machine shuddered to life and belched out an image. A map of all of Magica. Tiny red dots glowed here and there, hundreds of them. The man smiled. The secret eye worked, just as the ancient writings had predicted. This would make things much easier. It was time to go and take what was rightfully his.
Zan, you're next. Zan. Zan! Zan!
Zan blinked and looked at the teacher.
Sorry, Professor Liblo.
He said.
Could you repeat that?
Several of Zan's classmates laughed.
It's your turn to perform today's exercise.
Professor Liblo said patiently.
Please move your assigned objects according to my instructions.
Oh, okay.
Zan stood up. Everyone was watching him. He had no idea what instructions the teacher had given or what his assigned objects were. He'd been too busy daydreaming. He looked at the table at the front of the room. All sorts of things were sitting there: fruit, rocks, shoes, and more. Which items was he supposed to move?
Books.
A voice hissed behind him, too softly for the teacher to hear.
You're supposed to stack them by size.
It was Perda, his next-door neighbor and friend. He shot her a grateful look. Then he glanced at the books. Transporting stuff was easy, but it wasn't easy to do it with the control and precision that the teacher wanted, especially for someone like Zan. He was good at bigger magic, like zapping himself to a new place or creating clothing or food out of nothing. This smaller, more detailed type of magic was not easy. It required a quiet mind, and Zan's mind was rarely quiet. He rubbed his thumb against his other fingers. There was a crackling sound as sparks began to jump from his hand. Zan pointed at the largest book, and everything on the table flew into the air and exploded. The other students giggled, and Zan smiled sheepishly.
Oops.
He said.
Sorry about that.
Professor Liblo rubbed his hands together.
Restore!
He said. The items reappeared.
Try again, please, Zan. And try to focus this time. We don't want you accidentally transporting the entire school to the peak of Mount Mystery.
That made everyone laugh, including Zan. Then he tried again. This time, he did his best to focus.
Come to me.
He murmured. Now only the largest book rose. It flew through the air and landed gently on his desk. One by one, he brought the other books to him. Finally, a slim volume titled Dragon Taming Tips landed neatly atop the pile. Most of the class clapped. Zan gave a playful bow.
Pretty slow.
A boy said loudly.
And you had to use a focusing phrase. I thought Reds were supposed to be better at magic than the rest of us.
Enough, Jev.
The teacher said sternly.
If you think you can do better, you may go next.
Zan sat down.
Thanks for saving me.
He whispered to his friend. Perda leaned forward.
No problem, but you really should pay attention.
She whispered.
Even Reds can't just fake their way through every class they don't like.
Zan didn't answer. Physical objects was one of his least favorite classes. It was boring, even more boring than food and drink creation. When would he ever need to move things around like that anyway? He wasn't planning on becoming a physical builder or anything of the sort. No way. He was going to be an explorer like his parents. That's why he spent most of his time in school daydreaming about exciting adventures.
I'm finished.
Jev announced as he lined up one last shoe on his desk. He shot Zan a smug look.
Much faster than the red.
Zan frowned. Jev always had to make him look bad. Just then, a pretty girl named Gliss pointed to the door. Gliss was the only other red in the class besides Zan.
An echo crow!
She cried. A large purple-feathered crow flapped into the room.
Message! Message!
It squawked.
Urgent message from the king and queen!
Several kids gasped, and Zan sat up straight in his chair. He couldn't remember anyone from Magica's capital, First City, sending a message to boring old Swamp Bottom before. Especially not the king and queen.
Hush!
Professor Liblo told the class. Then he nodded to the crow.
Go on, please.
Urgent! Danger!
The crow squawked.
Danger for all Reds!
Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 2. Danger for Reds.
Danger for all Reds!
Gliss cried, echoing the crow's warning.
What does that mean?
Hush!
Professor Liblo said again.
Let it finish its message.
Echo crows didn't talk on their own. They could only repeat what a person told them. The crow flapped its wings.
Urgent danger!
It said again.
Reds are disappearing all over Magica! Nobody knows where they went or what has become of them! All Reds, please take precautions! Urgent! Urgent!
The echo crow clacked its beak. Then it flew out of the room. Everyone started talking at once. Well, almost everyone. Zan didn't say a word. The crow's message had made him think about his parents. Nobody knew where they were either, or what had become of them. But that was different. For one thing, they weren't Reds. For another, they had disappeared 4 long years ago. Perda poked him.
Did you hear that?
She said.
What do you think it means?
Silence!
Professor Liblo cried. His voice boomed with the help of a swelling spell. The class quieted down at once. Gliss raised her hand.
I need to go home.
She said, her voice cracking.
Both of my parents are Reds. I should tell them about this warning.
Me too.
Zan said.
My grandfather, Boz, is a Red.
What's the big deal?
Jev's voice was loud enough for Zan to hear, but not the teacher.
All those snooty Reds are probably sneaking off somewhere together. Maybe they're trying to come up with even more ways to act superior to the rest of us.
Be quiet, Jev.
Perda glared at him.
You're just jealous.
Gliss hadn't heard Jev. She stood up.
I just remembered something.
She said.
Last night, I overheard my parents whispering.
You overheard them?
Professor Liblo gave her a suspicious look.
How?
Gliss blushed.
Okay, I admit it. I used a spy fly. I know we're not supposed to use them to spy on people. But my parents wouldn't tell me why they look so worried lately. I had to find out what's going on.
Wow.
Thought Zan. If Gliss had used a spy fly, she must have been very concerned.
So what did you hear?
He asked.
It was about my uncle.
Gliss said.
He lives in New Mist.
You mean the town near Mount Mystery?
Zan said.
My parents haven't heard from Uncle Gar in 3 days.
Gliss said.
He's a Red too.
Oh dear.
Professor Liblo shook his head.
This sounds rather serious. Perhaps you'd better go home. It's almost time to go anyway. Class dismissed.
The students started gathering their things and chattering about what had just happened. Zan grabbed his bag and hurried out of the room with Perda.
I should find out what Boz knows about this,
Zan said.
He's a retired magic master, remember? Maybe some of his friends in the capital know what's going on.
Perta gave him a look.
You sound almost excited.
She said.
Aren't you scared? You and Boz are both Reds.
Before Zan could respond, Jev came into the hall with some friends.
Rushing home to hide under your bed, Red?
Jev jeered. Zan didn't answer. Jev had never forgiven him for an incident on Zan's first day at the Swamp Bottom school almost 4 years earlier. But even if that had never happened, they still wouldn't be friends. Jev seemed to hate all Reds. Well, not all Reds. Just then, Gliss hurried out of the classroom, and Jev's voice instantly changed from sneering to sympathetic.
Hey, Gliss. Sorry your uncle is missing. Want me to walk you home?
Thanks, that's sweet. But I'm in too much of a hurry to walk.
Gliss rubbed her hands together and muttered the word zap. A second later, she disappeared. Jev frowned and then zapped himself away too. Zan was glad to see him go.
Come on,
He told Perta.
I'll walk you home in case you're afraid of disappearing without a trace.
I'm not the one who should be afraid.
She retorted.
The crow said the warning was only for Reds.
Okay,
Zan said.
then you can walk me home.
She smiled.
It's a deal. Let's go.
They headed for home. It was a bright, clear day with a light breeze that blew Perta's soft caramel-colored hair around her face. Was it magic, or did she seem to get prettier every day? Zan tried not to notice that. It made him feel confused and nervous, a lot more nervous than he'd felt on hearing the Echo Crow's message. When they reached Perta's house, she sighed.
Looks like Mom's been redecorating again.
The house had been square and blue that morning when the kids left for school. Now it was a multicolored blob.
Hey, she lives in Swamp Bottom, remember?
Zan joked.
She has to do something to lessen the boredom.
Perta rolled her eyes.
See you tomorrow.
She said.
Bye.
Zan headed next door. His grandfather wasn't very interested in redecorating, so their house looked the same as always. In other words, it was just as boring as everything else in Swamp Bottom. For a second, Zan wondered how his mother might redecorate the place. She'd always been good at that sort of thing. She'd love to surprise him by turning his bedroom into a spooky cave or a mysterious jungle. He snapped out of those thoughts when he heard a rustling sound directly overhead. Glancing up, he barely had time to take in a dragon's snarling face hissing down at him. Zan jumped back just in time. A bolt of flame sizzled down, incinerating the ground where he just stood. Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 3. The Magic Master.
Zing!
Zan exclaimed.
You oversized swamp rat! I'll get you for that!
Picking up a rock, he tossed it at the dragon. Zing ducked the rock, chattering in annoyance. Zan grinned.
What do you expect?
He said.
You just tried to roast me!
The dragon hopped down from the roof, not bothering to unfurl its leathery wings. It landed beside Zan with a thump. He bent to scratch its pointy little head.
Did you eat yet?
He asked.
Let's go inside. I'll conjure up some food for you as soon as I tell Boz about the warning.
The dragon chirped agreeably. Many people kept dragons as pets, but fire whistlers like Zing weren't very popular. The breed was too active, too independent, and a little too unpredictable. Besides, most people didn't like dealing with a pet that could set you on fire. But Zing was perfect for Zan. They spent hours together. Their favorite game was to lie in wait and attack each other. Zan reached for his school bag, which he'd dropped during Zing's surprise attack.
You'd better sleep with one eye open,
he told the dragon jokingly. Dragons couldn't talk, but the smarter ones could understand some human speech.
because when you least expect it, I'm going to grab you and feed you to the water blobs.
Zing hissed playfully, sending out a spurt of flame that Zan dodged easily. He laughed, glancing around for another rock. Before he could find one, the door flew open.
Get in here.
Boz ordered, the tip of his long, pointy nose quivering as it always did when he was worked up about something. Zan's grandfather was clutching the tattered diary in which he recorded everything important that happened to him.
I need to talk to you.
Zan guessed that Boz had already heard about the message,
I'm coming.
he said. Like the outside, the inside of their house rarely changed. Half the furniture was boring and utilitarian, transported there by Boz from his old home in First City. The rest was cool stuff that Zan's parents had conjured, mostly based on interesting things they had seen in their travels. A statue of a frightening beast from the slopes of Mount Mystery, replicas of the low-slung chairs used by nomadic settlers way out on the far frontier, and an exotic-looking lamp from some other faraway world. That lamp was Zan's favorite. He paused beside it, resting a hand on its lumpy surface and glancing at the framed blink images of his family hanging on the walls. Could his parents be trapped in some mysterious other world even now? Could they still be alive despite what most people thought? Zing scampered over to grab a scorched chew toy. Boz stared at Zan. His large brown eyes were troubled.
I'm glad you're home,
he said, setting his diary on the table.
I thought about going down to your school to get you. Have you heard about the warning from the palace?
Zan nodded.
An echo crow came to school. The message sounded pretty weird. Why would Reds suddenly start disappearing?
I don't know.
Boz rubbed his nose to stop it from quivering.
I've sent messages to a few friends to see if any of them know anything, but they haven't responded. That worries me, especially since they're all Reds.
He tapped one finger against another, and several message moths appeared. Boz focused his gaze on one, muttering a message under his breath. As he spoke, tiny words etched themselves onto the moth's powdery wings. Zan couldn't help being impressed. Most people had to inscribe message moths by hand. Only a few people had the focus to do it by eye. Sometimes it was easy to forget that his grandfather had been one of the most powerful magic masters in the kingdom. Zan wondered if he himself would ever develop that kind of control over his own powers. He realized Boz had finished inscribing the message moths and was talking again. He just said something about wanting Zan to stay at home.
What?
Zan blurted out.
But I told Darb I'd meet him at the swamp after dinner.
Sorry, Zan. We need to be careful until I find out what we're dealing with.
Boz waved a hand to send the moths fluttering out the window.
I can't risk you wandering off.
What's the difference? It's not like anything ever happens way out here in Swamp Bottom. I still don't know why you decided to move to this place after Mom and Dad disappeared. We'll never find out what happened to them while we're stuck out here in this boring old backwater.
I'll make dinner in an hour,
was all Boz said.
You'd better get started on your homework.
Typical,
thought Zan. Boz never wanted to talk about what had happened to Zan's parents. Zan didn't get it. Didn't Boz want to find them if they were still out there somewhere?
Come here, Zing,
he called.
Dinner time.
He rubbed his fingers together and pointed at the dragon's food dish. A big helping of green, slimy dragon mush appeared. Zing flapped his wings in thanks. Then he shot out a flicker of flame and instantly cooked the mush. It smelled disgusting, but the dragon slurped it up eagerly. Zan turned around and realized Boz was watching him.
I'm not trying to ruin your fun, Zan,
Boz said.
I just want to protect you.
I know.
Zan felt guilty for his earlier thoughts.
It's okay.
But after dinner, Zan felt much too restless to sit in his room and study. He checked to make sure Boz wasn't nearby. Then he rubbed his hands together and zapped himself out of the house. Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 4, The Swamp. Zan landed in a puddle of swampy water.
Drat,
he muttered. His conveyance teacher was always scolding him for this sort of thing. Being a Red, Zan could zap himself far and fast. But his focus still needed some work. That didn't matter now, though. He was out of the house. It was time to find Darb. Pursing his lips, he whistled, trying to imitate the call of a lesser swamp swift.
Not bad.
A voice said from the grassy hillock behind him.
I always knew you had talents other than magic.
Zan spun around and grinned.
Hey, Darb.
He said, stepping out of the water.
Sorry I'm late. Boz didn't want me to go out.
Because of the warning about Reds disappearing?
Darb asked thoughtfully.
I've been hearing about that.
Darb was a void, one of a small group of people in Magica born without any magical abilities. That was the reason he and Zan had met in the first place. On Zan's first day at the Swamp Bottom School, he'd encountered Jev and his friends teasing Darb. Zan had told them to stop.
Who's going to make me?
Jev had sneered.
That red hair of yours doesn't mean you get to tell me what to do.
Then he'd turned and shoved Darb into the wall hard. Looking back, Zan knew he probably should have called a teacher. Instead, he'd acted on impulse, rubbing his fingers together until sparks began to jump from his hand. Jev didn't even know what had happened until his friends started snickering and pointing at him. Zan had given him a pair of oversized donkey ears. It took Jev several tries to undo the spell. Ever since then, Jev had been Zan's enemy, and Darb had been Zan's friend. Darb didn't attend school anymore. Voids were only required to study the basics of theory and history. Once classes started doing practical magic lessons, Voids usually dropped out and studied on their own. Most ended up finding careers as companions, greeters, animal caretakers, and mediators, or other jobs that required no magic. Most people in Magica would never purposely discriminate against a Void, but Zan had noticed that people said things in front of Darb that they wouldn't say in front of others. It was as if they thought Voids were deaf and dumb as well as lacking magic. That didn't seem fair to Zan, but it did allow Darb to hear a lot of interesting gossip.
What have you heard about the warning?
Zan asked his friend now.
Not much.
Darb said.
Everyone's talking about the message from the palace, though. The mayor is so nervous that she put a shield spell over the entire town hall.
Boz is trying to find out more. In the meantime, he wants me to stay inside.
Zan rolled his eyes.
You can't blame him for being worried after what happened to your parents.
I guess.
Zan jumped onto a larger hillock.
So what have you been doing?
Studying insects.
Insects, huh?
Zan said.
Why not study something more exciting? Dragons, maybe.
Speaking of dragons, where's Zing?
Darb asked.
He was outside when I left. I couldn't get him without Boz seeing me.
Darb looked disappointed. Everyone assumed he'd end up being an animal caretaker someday. He loved animals of all kinds, and they loved him. Zing broke into a happy whistling song whenever he saw him. Darb stepped toward a slow-moving stream.
Look, panic bugs.
He leaned closer for a better look.
Can you get a picture of them for me?
Sure.
Zan rubbed his hands together and stared at the shiny red bugs. Blink! A piece of paper appeared and fluttered to the swampy ground. Zan picked it up. The image of the panic bugs was there in full color.
Thanks.
Darb took the blink image, folded it, and put it into his pocket. Then he gently scooped up the bugs and put them in his other pocket, being careful not to startle them into releasing their stink.
Want to help me look for leeches?
He asked.
I've seen them around here before.
Leeches?
Zan echoed.
Why?
I've been reading about them. It's fascinating how they can suck the magic out of people.
Yeah.
Zan grinned.
Back in First City, my friends and I used to stick them on each other as a joke. It would take about 1 million of them to drain enough magic to make a difference, but it was still funny.
Darb peered into the water's murky depths.
Leeches are very shy,
He said.
They live at the bottom of streams like this. We'll have to be quiet and feel around in the water.
Why go to all that trouble?
Zan rubbed his fingers together.
I'll displace the water. Then you can grab as many leeches as you want.
Zan, wait!
Darb began.
That won't...
The water in the nearest section of the stream levitated, hanging as droplets in the air. Several fish and other creatures were left lying on the bottom of the stream bed, looking confused.
Leeches!
Zan cried, pointing. Almost before he spotted them, the slimy little creatures had burrowed into the soft sand.
Oh, they're gone.
I tried to tell you that.
Darb said with a sigh.
They dive away from air unless they're latched onto someone.
Sorry.
Zan said.
Hey, did you hear that?
Hear what?
Zan tilted his head, listening.
That buzzing noise.
He said.
Sounds like an irritated spy fly. Or maybe...
A loud, angry buzzing drowned out his words. Suddenly, a whole swarm of tiny, glittering dragons came zipping out of a hole in the bank and started stinging him. Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 5. The Visitor.
Whoa!
Zan cried as he and Darb ran.
What are those things?
I don't know.
Darb flapped his hands, trying to ward off the angry little creatures. They kept diving at the boys, stinging any exposed skin they could reach.
Let's go to the hollow. It's close, and they probably won't follow us there.
Zan glanced in the direction of the hollow. The place made him nervous. It was a vacuum, and magic didn't work in a vacuum. Most magical creatures feared and avoided such places. In fact, it was probably the only place Zan would never dare to go. In the hollow, he'd have no way at all to protect himself.
I've got a better idea,
Zan said. He grabbed Darb's arm and then zapped them both away. They landed in another part of the swamp, far from the tiny dragons.
Phew!
Darb grimaced.
Can you do anything about these stings?
Hold still.
Zan rubbed his hands together and touched the red marks on Darb's arms and face. The marks faded away.
Thanks,
Darb said. Zan healed his own stings.
So you don't know what those were?
He asked.
I thought you were an expert in that stuff.
Darb shook his head.
They looked like dragons, but the only dragons that small are mini flower sippers. And you know what they're like. They don't sting.
Maybe they're not from Magica,
Zan said.
Maybe there's a wormhole near here.
You mean a portal to another world?
Darb looked doubtful.
I thought those were really rare and really dangerous.
They are. Most people think my parents got lost in one. Or maybe went through an unstable one that closed behind them.
Zan started to feel excited.
Let's go back and... Oh!
Zan was nearly knocked off his feet. He grabbed a tree to steady himself.
What's wrong?
Darb asked. The feeling had already passed.
It's Boz,
Zan said.
I just felt him. He's not happy.
Was it a red share?
Zan nodded. A red share happened when a red felt an especially strong emotion. Any red with a connection to the other red would feel it too.
Boz probably just realized I sneaked out.
Zan said.
It was a strong share, which means he must be really mad. Or really scared. He seemed pretty worried about that warning. Either way, I'd better get home.
Okay.
Darb tucked an escaping panic bug back into his pocket.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah, if Boz doesn't lock me in the house with a super shield spell, that is.
Zan rubbed his hands together.
Focus,
he thought. The last thing he needed was to miss his mark and land on the roof or in Zing's food dish. Zap! He landed in the house's main room.
Right on target,
he murmured. He glanced around, but Boz was nowhere in sight. Instead, Zan saw a man looking at the family pictures on the wall.
Who are you?
Zan blurted out.
Where's my grandfather?
The stranger spun around. He was tall and gaunt, with glittering amber eyes. An odd expression flickered across his narrow face.
Another red.
The man said. He pointed at one of the blink images.
Are these your parents, young man?
Zan noticed his grandfather's diary on the floor under the table. That was strange. Boz never went anywhere without his diary, and he'd never leave it lying around on the floor.
That's none of your business,
Zan told the stranger, suddenly nervous.
Where's Boz?
Is that any way to speak to a guest in your home?
The corners of the man's thin lips twisted into a half smile.
I happen to be an old friend of your grandfather's.
Zan wasn't sure what to say.
Boz?
He yelled.
Where are you?
The stranger smirked.
You can call as loudly as you like, he won't hear you. But I can take you to him if you wish.
Who are you? What are you doing here?
Zan clenched his fists at his sides.
And what have you done with Boz?
Just then, he heard scratching at the door. Zing! Zan quickly rubbed his hands together and pointed at the door.
Open!
It flew open. Zing leaped into the room, shooting a stream of flame toward the stranger.
Good boy.
Zan cried.
That'll teach him to...
But quick as a wink, the stranger lifted his hand.
No!
Shouted Zan.
Freeze!
Said the stranger, pointing at the dragon. Zing instantly crashed to the floor, not moving.
Zing!
Zan fell to his knees. Zing was breathing very slowly. Realizing what the man had done, Zan turned to face him.
You used a flash freeze on him!
He accused.
That's illegal! He's a tame dragon!
Magica had few laws aside from the important one taught to everyone from birth. Do no harm to others. But everyone knew that a flash freeze should only be used in emergencies, such as immobilizing a large rampaging wild dragon. It was never supposed to be used on people or pets.
I never did like dragons.
The man said, examining the sparks that still ran across his hand.
Or reds, for that matter.
He rubbed his fingers together. Sparks leapt from his hand now, much more strongly than Zan would have expected from such a small amount of friction.
Freeze!
The man said, pointing toward Zan. Acting on instinct, Zan quickly grabbed Zing and rubbed his hands together. He felt the flash freeze sizzle within a hair breadth of his face as he zapped himself and Zing away. Within half a second, they landed in the front yard. And half a second after that, Zan's house exploded into a million pieces. Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 6. In Hiding. Zan stared in shock as bits and pieces of his house went flying everywhere. Then a huge plank flew out of the cloud of thick smoke, almost hitting him in the head. Zan snapped out of his stupor. He nudged Zing with his foot. The dragon was groggy, but already beginning to emerge from the flash freeze. That was one especially good thing about fire whistlers. Even the strongest magic couldn't keep them down for long. They were too stubborn.
Wake up, boy.
Zan urged the dragon.
We've got to get out of here.
He doubted the stranger could have survived that explosion. But then Zan remembered the strong energy crackling between the man's fingers. He'd better not take any chances.
I'll go find Darb,
he murmured. Darb might be a void, but he was smart and practical. Maybe he could help Zan figure out what to do. Zan took off running. Zing shook off the last of the spell and flew after him, chattering irritably and breathing out small puffs of smoke. They found Darb in the same part of the swamp where Zan had left him. He looked startled when he saw Zan coming with Zing.
What happened to you two?
He asked. Zan glanced down at himself. His clothes were disheveled, debris stuck to his sleeves, and he was covered in dust.
Something crazy,
he began. He told Darb the whole story as quickly as he could. By the end, Darb looked alarmed.
That guy used a flash freeze on Zing?
He exclaimed, hurrying over to the dragon.
Come here, little buddy. Let's make sure you're okay.
He tried to use one on me, too!
Zan exclaimed.
What kind of crazy person does that?
I don't know.
Darb looked at him.
Do you think Boz was still in the house when it, exploded?
Zan shook his head.
That guy said something about taking me to Boz. I'd better try to contact my grandfather.
Zan conjured up a message moth and quickly inscribed a simple message on its wings. Where are you?
Find Boz,
he said, waving the message moth off. The message moth started to flap away. But within a few seconds it came back, fluttering in helpless circles. Darb frowned as he watched.
It can't locate him,
he said softly.
Do you think...
Zan's heart flip-flopped in his chest. It had been difficult enough to deal with his parents' disappearance. What would he do if he lost his grandfather as well?
No!
Zan blurted out, not letting himself think any more about that.
I'm sure he's okay. We just need to figure out where he is.
The stranger stepped out of the ruins of Zan's house. He'd barely had time to throw up a strong shield spell before the place had exploded. That explosion had been an unlucky break. The red boy had been especially quick. The energy from his emergency zap had collided with the flash freeze, causing the blast. And now, the explosion was likely to draw unwanted attention.
Never mind.
The man muttered.
I just need to find the boy before he tells anyone about me.
But how? He could return to the fortress and check the secret eye, but the secret eye merely showed the presence and location of Magica's Reds. It didn't show their identities. The boy would be one red dot among many. Or would he? Glancing down at the debris, the man happened to spot the charred remains of one of those Happy Family Blink images. Grabbing it, he stared at the red boy's grinning face. The man smiled. The image should do the trick. Yes, it should do nicely.
There!
Zan rubbed his hands together and pointed at the cave entrance. A dark curtain instantly fell over it.
That will keep out anyone we don't want in here.
He looked around the cave. He and his friends had gathered here many times, and no adults knew about it. It was the perfect hiding place. The entrance was already well hidden by thick brush. Zan's simple visual blocking spell meant nobody could see in even from a few inches away. Zan had used the same type of spell many times to trick Zing during their games.
Okay,
Darb said.
now what?
He was patting Zing, who still looked tired and uneasy. Zan realized he was exhausted too. He'd used up most of his energy creating their hideout. First, he'd had to run a quick life force locator to make sure the cave was clear of any dangerous creatures. Then, he'd conjured up a few lights so he could see what he was doing. And finally, there was the curtain. Being a red gave Zan more power than most kids his age, but after all that, he'd hit his limit. He flopped down against the wall.
I need to figure out where Boz went,
He said.
That guy at my house said he knew him. I have no idea if he was telling the truth.
Darb shrugged.
Why would someone lie about something like that?
Zan sighed. Darb was much too trusting. He always wanted to believe the best about people. Zan had been the same way himself once, but his parents' disappearance had changed that.
Think about it.
He said.
Reds have been disappearing all over Magica. Then this weirdo shows up at my house, and suddenly Boz is missing. The guy has to be involved with whatever the palace was.
He stopped talking with a gasp as the magic curtain shattered and a fast-moving figure burst into the cave. Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 7, The Directory. Zan let out a yell, and Zing let out a blast of flame before they both realized who had just burst into the cave.
Herta!
Zan exclaimed.
You shouldn't sneak up on people like that!
She smirked, quickly rubbing her fingers together and touching her arm to repair the spot where Zing had just singed her.
If you didn't want me in here, you should have used a shield spell.
She said.
What's the point?
Zan said.
You know all my passwords. You'd get past a shield spell too.
True,
Perta's smile faded quickly, and her eyes filled with worry.
but listen, I'm glad I found you. Did you know your house...
Just blew up?
Zan finished grimly.
Yes. Zing and I barely got away.
What about Boz?
Perta asked anxiously.
I don't think he was there.
Zan said.
Here's what happened.
He told her the same story he'd just told Darb. Perta listened quietly.
Wow.
She said when Zan had finished.
And you didn't recognize the guy?
I've never seen him before in my life.
Zan replied.
Did you check the directory?
Zan blinked. Why hadn't he thought of that?
Not yet.
He said, shooting a sheepish glance toward Darb.
We're just about to do that.
Here, I'll pull it up.
Perta snapped her fingers. A book-like image appeared in midair, floating at eye level.
Identification needed.
Zan said.
Adult male.
Instantly, the book disappeared, replaced by a long list of names. The names were in tiny print, since they represented every adult male in Magica. A picture floated beside each name, though the images were far too minuscule to be seen clearly. For a second, Zan was tempted to check the list and see if his father was listed, or Boz, but he resisted the temptation. He had checked his father's listing before. It was still there, but with a special notation at the top: missing, presumed deceased, or permanently off-world. As for Boz, it was too soon for his directory status to have changed, no matter what had happened.
Well,
Perda said, sounding impatient.
is there anything else you can remember about this guy? You need to narrow the search down a little.
I know, I'm just thinking.
Zan tried to remember what the stranger had looked like.
Taller than average, thinner than average, between 30 and 50 years old.
He watched as the list rearranged itself, the names getting bigger as their numbers became fewer.
Pale skin, long, thinning dark hair.
What color were his eyes?
Perda prompted.
I'm trying to remember. I wasn't exactly gazing into his eyes at the time, you know.
Zan said.
Here, I'll help.
Perda held out both her hands.
Help with what?
Zan understood that she was offering to combine her magic with his. Anyone could do that to make a spell stronger. What he didn't understand was what spells she thought they should do. Perda sighed.
Don't you ever pay attention in mental magic class? We just covered enhanced short-term memory spells last month.
Oh, right.
Zan lifted his own hands and rubbed his palms against hers. Sparks began to crackle between them.
Recall,
he murmured, trying to focus on the memory of the man's face. Just like that, the image popped into his head. It was as clear as if the stranger were standing right in front of him. Zan shuddered, quickly dropping his hands from Perda's.
Amber eyes,
he said.
Small, mean-looking amber eyes, to be precise. Narrow face with sunken cheeks.
He went on, adding as many details as he could. With each one, the list of names grew shorter. Soon there were only a few names left on the floating screen. By now, both names and images were large enough to see easily.
Do you recognize any of the pictures?
Darb asked, peering at the directory.
I'm not sure.
Zan scanned the entries.
Wait! There he is! That's him!
Zan pointed at one of the images. Instantly, all the other entries dropped away.
Full entry, please.
More words appeared beneath the name and picture.
Name, Morb.
Perda read.
Home, Dragon's Peak Mount Mystery. Current occupation, unknown.
Dragon's Peak?
Zan said.
Isn't that the village that's always having trouble with trolls?
Wait, this can't be the right person after all.
Darb spoke up.
Look, he's a void.
He pointed to another part of the entry.
A void?
Zan echoed.
But that doesn't make sense. This is definitely the guy that was at my house. Yet there's no way a void could do what he did. The entry must be wrong.
Perda moved her hand, causing the directory to scroll down.
It can't be wrong,
she said.
There are lots of mentions of him being a void. See? It even says he used to work as an animal caretaker. That's a void job.
Zan glanced at the entry.
Wait, go back,
he said.
Check it out. This Morb guy used to work at my parents' research laboratory at the university.
Really? Then maybe Morb isn't connected to the Royal Warning at all.
Perda suggested.
He might have been looking for your parents or something.
But he said he knew where Boz was. And why would he try to use the flash freeze on me? That doesn't make any sense.
Zan's right. This has to be connected to the disappearances of Red somehow.
Darb said.
I guess you're right.
Perda gasped.
Bliss!
Huh?
Zan said.
She's a Red, and so are both her parents.
Perda said.
If Morb is after Reds, he'll probably try to get them too. We have to warn her.
Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 8. Leeches. Several trolls were waiting when Morb arrived back at the fortress. The leader, an especially large and ugly troll, grunted. A fuzzy image of a figure trapped behind iron bars appeared briefly above his head before quickly fading out. Morb tried to hide his disdain. Trolls were disgusting creatures, with their rough magic and rougher appetites. But he needed them, at least for now.
Prepare the treatment.
He ordered the troll. The trolls lumbered off. Morb strode across the room and down a steep stone stairwell. At the bottom was a heavy wooden door. As soon as he pushed it open, the prisoners began crying out. There were now more than a dozen of them in the cells, peering out from behind the heavy iron bars. But Morb barely looked at most of them. His eyes went directly to one particular cell. The long-nosed old man inside stared back defiantly. His hands and legs were tied so he couldn't move without falling over, but he stood tall and proud despite the restraints.
You!
Boz spat out as Morb approached.
I should have guessed when I heard the news. You never could accept that you weren't meant to.
Silence!
Morb cut him off. He turned toward the door.
I'm ready.
He called loudly. Heavy footsteps tromped down the stairs. A pair of trolls came in, lugging an iron cauldron between them. The prisoners shrank back fearfully when they saw it, all except Boz.
What are you going to do, Morb?
He demanded.
Feed me to your pet trolls? The Red Council will hear about this, have no doubt. Using flash freezes and dowsing spells, holding people prisoner, you won't get away with it.
Morb ignored him. The trolls tipped the cauldron, spilling its contents. Leeches, dozens of enormous pale blue leeches. Their faces turned this way and that. They could sense the powerful magic of all the red prisoners nearby.
Get Boz,
Morb said. The leeches slowly wriggled between the bars and into Boz's cell. Boz looked startled.
Where did those things come from?
He exclaimed.
There are no leeches that size anywhere in Magica. How did you... Ah!
The rest of his words were lost as the leeches slithered up his legs. Their pale bodies brightened to a vivid electric blue as they fed on Boz's magic. Morb watched for a moment, enjoying the sight. Then he turned away. He still had unfinished business to deal with before he could put the rest of his plan into motion. He hurried back upstairs, pulled out the picture he'd taken from Boz's house, and carefully ripped out the boy's face. Morb then stepped toward the secret eye, his gaze on the ancient skull at the top. Then he noticed a flutter of movement. Turning his head, he saw an insect hovering just outside the window.
A spy fly?
He murmured.
Now who would want to spy on little old me?
The spy fly sensed it had been spotted. It spun around to fly off. But Morb was too quick for it. Rubbing his fingers together, he blew it to pieces with an extra strong flash freeze. Then he gently placed the red boy's picture into one of the skull's eye sockets. Stepping back, he watched as the map above slowly started to change.
Stay here.
Zan ordered Zing.
We'll be back soon.
The dragon spat fire at him. Zan rolled his eyes.
Let me talk to him.
Darb knelt in front of Zing.
Listen, buddy, we need you to guard the cave while we check on Gliss, okay?
Zing continued to look skeptical for a second. Then finally, he whistled happily, wriggling his whole body. Zan sighed. The dragon never could resist Darb's charms. It was kind of annoying.
Let's go.
Perta said, grabbing Darb's hand.
I've got Darb.
Meet you in Gliss's living room.
Zan closed his eyes, focusing his mind. This was no time to be sloppy. He'd been in Gliss's house several times. Her parents were always inviting him over. It was actually a little embarrassing. They seemed to think that because Zan and Gliss were the only two Reds in their level, they should be friends. Maybe even more than friends. Zan tried not to get distracted by that. He and Gliss weren't especially close, but he liked her fine. He definitely didn't want to see her captured by this Morb character.
Zap,
he whispered. Bam! He landed hard on the ground, with the wind knocked out of him. Opening his eyes, he saw Gliss's house.
Oof!
Perta grunted beside him. She and Darb appeared, both of them also flung off their feet.
What happened?
Darb asked. Zan stood up, wincing.
they must have a shield spell up.
No wonder.
Perta said.
They're probably worried about the warning. But it means we're blocked out too.
No big deal.
Darb said.
It is possible to get into a house without using magic, you know.
He smiled.
It's called knocking on the door.
Zan!
Gliss's mother exclaimed when she answered the door.
You shouldn't be out right now. Haven't you heard the news?
She quickly ushered all the kids inside. Her husband and Gliss were in the main room.
You're okay!
Perda exclaimed, rushing over to Gliss.
Listen,
Zan told Gliss's parents.
we just figured out who's behind all the trouble.
You did? Gliss's father said.
I'll show you.
Zan snapped his fingers to call up the directory.
Morb.
He said when the book appeared. But before the image could fully form, there was a sudden blinding flash. The next thing Zan knew, a familiar figure was standing before him.
You called?
Morb said with a sneer. Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 9. Pursued by Evil.
Who are you?
Gliss's mother screamed at Morb.
How did you get past our shield?
It's him!
Zan shouted.
The man we were telling you about!
Morb ignored him.
Freeze!
He intoned, pointing at Gliss's parents. Instantly, her parents froze in place. Her mother's eyes were wide and frightened. Her father's mouth was open in the middle of a shout.
Mom! Dad!
Gliss shrieked. Morb made a beckoning motion. A second later, two large, hideous trolls appeared.
Take them to the dungeon.
Morb ordered the trolls. Another quick flash, and the trolls disappeared, along with Gliss's parents.
No!
Gliss screamed.
We have to get out of here!
Zan shouted. He rubbed his hands together. Perda was already doing the same. But not Gliss. She just stood there.
She's in shock!
Zan said.
Even if we get away!
There was no time to say more. Morb had turned toward them. He glanced at Perda with disinterest. But when he saw Gliss, he smirked.
Another red.
He said, raising his hand.
No!
Darb cried. He reached into his pocket and flung a handful of panic bugs into Morb's face.
Ugh.
Morb exclaimed as the little insects panicked, releasing their foul-smelling odor.
Get away from me, you repulsive creatures!
It only took Morb a few seconds to blast the bugs to smithereens. But that was enough time.
Get her!
Zan shouted at Perda. Perda grabbed Gliss. Zap! They both disappeared. Zan dived for Darb. His hand closed on his friend's arm just as Morb spun toward them. The man's eyes narrowed.
Don't you dare!
He exclaimed.
This time you're not getting away from...
Zap! Splash!
Drat!
Zan cried.
How come I always land in the swamp?
Forget that.
Darb said breathlessly.
At least you got us out of there.
Zan nodded.
Good thinking using those panic bugs. You probably saved us all.
Thanks.
Darb looked sad.
I wish he hadn't blasted them, though.
Zan wasn't going to waste time mourning a bunch of smelly insects.
We better find the girls.
He waved a hand to summon a spy fly. Suddenly, Morb materialized in front of them.
Stop right there!
He exclaimed.
What?
Zan cried, startled.
How did you...
He didn't bother to finish. Grabbing Darb, he zapped them away again. This time, he aimed for the cave where Zing was waiting.
Whew!
He said when they landed.
That was close. How in the world did he...
Again, Morb appeared.
Give up, Red! You can't escape!
Zan instantly grabbed both Darb and Zing. This time, he didn't have time to think of a destination.
Ouch!
Darb exclaimed as they landed on a craggy boulder.
How's Morb doing this?
Zan cried.
He can't follow us through a zap unless we leave him a trail.
Darb didn't answer. He just grabbed Zan as Morb appeared again. Morb cackled.
I told you, it's no use trying to escape. My magic is far superior to...
Zap! Darb yanked on Zan's arm as they landed near a stream where they'd often fished for moon minnows.
Come with me,
He urged.
What?
Zan was rubbing his hands, preparing to zap again. He hoped his magical energy held out until he could figure out what to do.
Come on!
Darb took off running, with Zing flying behind him.
Darb, wait!
Zan chased after them.
You'll never escape that guy without magic!
Darb didn't answer. He dove into a thick clump of bushes. Zan followed.
What are you doing?
Hush!
Darb crawled forward, peering out from among the dense branches. Morb soon appeared in the spot where the boys had landed.
This game is becoming tiresome.
He glanced around.
You might as well give up. Trust me, you do not want to anger me further.
Quick, let's zap away again before he...
Zan hissed.
No!
Darb cut him off.
Don't you get it? He's tracking your magic somehow.
Could Darb be right? Zan had never heard of someone tracking people through their magic. Then he remembered.
I think we studied that last year.
He said.
But that kind of magic has been banned since the old times.
Flash freezes are illegal too.
Darb reminded him.
And Morb has been using them.
So what can we do?
Zan felt helpless. If Morb could find him every time he used magic, there was no escape.
Let's get to the hollow,
Darb said.
His magic can't find us there. It'll give us time to think.
Zan gulped. The hollow? He would feel even more helpless there. But Darb was right. They had to get away from Morb long enough to figure out what was going on.
Okay.
Zan sneaked another peek at Morb.
But first I've got to use magic once more to let Perta know what's happening.
Darb looked worried.
Morb will know where you are as soon as you summon the moth. You won't have time to inscribe the message.
Zan bit his lip.
Good point.
Darb smiled.
Then again, I just happen to know that message moths like to rest in shady underbrush. So, if we can find one without using magic...
He carefully crawled around, peering under leaves. Seconds later, he cupped his hands around a fluttering insect.
Awesome!
Zan whispered. Grabbing the moth, he quickly inscribed his message onto its wings. Don't use any magic. Meet at the hollow. Darb was peering out.
He's getting closer,
He whispered.
Better do it now.
Perta.
Zan told the moth. He rubbed his fingers together and released the creature.
Aha!
Morb howled triumphantly from very close by.
Zap!
Zan yelled, focusing on the spot right outside the hollow. Red Magic. The Battle for Magica. Chapter 10. The Hollow.
Where do you think they took my parents?
Gliss asked tearfully.
I don't know.
Zan tried to answer patiently, even though Gliss had asked the same question about 50 times already.
It'll be okay.
Perta put an arm around Gliss's shoulders.
We'll figure out how to save them. And Boz and all the others too.
An hour had passed since Zan had zapped himself, Darb, and Zing to within a few paces of the hollow. Zing had whimpered as soon as he'd realized where they were. But Darb had coaxed the nervous dragon into following him and Zan into the hollow. They'd peered out as Morb appeared. He'd looked around in confusion, muttered a few angry words, and then zapped himself away again. Darb's plan had worked. Being in the hollow had blocked whatever spell Morb was using to track Zan. A few minutes later, Perta and Gliss had arrived on foot. Now it was getting dark, and they were all still in the hollow. The hollow was a low, grassy spot protected by a thick tangle of thorny vines. The only entrance lay between the gnarled trunks of two ancient mood trees, and nobody who didn't know it was there would ever notice it. Not even Morb, whoever he might really be.
We need to figure out how a void got such strong magic.
Zan said.
Enough to perform flash freezes and whatever tracking spell he was using to follow me.
Gliss looked confused.
How would a void get any magic at all?
She asked.
It's impossible, isn't it?
Not totally,
Zan said.
I knew a void when I lived in First City. His mom was a red, and she infused a pair of gloves with a little bit of magic he could use each day. Just enough to conjure up lunch and stuff like that.
Zan was surprised that Gliss didn't know about that sort of thing. Then again, she'd lived in Swamp Bottom all her life. There were only a few voids in town, and most seemed content to rely on others for what little magic they needed to get by. It was different in the larger towns and cities, where people weren't as neighborly.
But that's not the kind of magic we're talking about.
Perta said.
No magic-infused glove could do a flash freeze. The magic would be too weak. You couldn't even use it to zap yourself 6 inches away.
I know.
Zan was thinking hard.
The directory said Morb worked in the research lab at the university, remember? Maybe he learned about some stronger kind of infusion. Researchers are always working on new forms of magic there.
Perta looked skeptical.
If researchers were working on something that big, we would have heard about it.
She said.
Every void in Magica would be lining up to try it. Right, Darb?
Darb shrugged and kept petting Zing, who lay beside him looking anxious and miserable.
I wonder how Morb got those trolls to work with him.
Darb said. Perta shuddered.
Oh, those trolls were scary. I never saw a real one before. Only pictures and books.
Gliss wasn't paying much attention to the others.
I can't believe my parents are gone.
She moaned.
We need to find them.
I know,
Zan said.
I'm worried about my grandfather, too. But Morb got a good look at all of us. Who knows what he'd do if he saw us again?
We already know what he'd do to you two.
Perta glanced at Zan and Gliss.
He'd summon his trolls to carry you off.
Darb stepped toward the entrance and looked out.
Maybe I should sneak back to town.
He suggested.
I could let our families know what happened and see what I can find out.
No way,
Zan said.
It's too risky.
Perta nodded.
If we hide out here for a while, the grown-ups will take care of everything, right?
Nobody said anything for a long moment. Zan felt sick and scared. He'd always longed for adventure and excitement. Now he'd found it. But somehow it wasn't nearly as much fun as he'd imagined it would be. Darb was still staring out into the night.
Look!
He said suddenly.
Here comes a message moth. We'd better see who it's for.
Zan's heart thumped.
Are you sure that's a good idea? What if Morb can track us through it?
I doubt it.
Perta said.
Otherwise, he would have found me and Gliss when you sent us that message earlier.
Right. It seemed like his tracking spell worked by locating the person who was creating the magic.
Darb said in his logical way.
It probably doesn't track the moth itself, or the person that it's going to.
I hope you're right.
Zan stepped outside with the others. The moth immediately fluttered over to him. He gently held the creature in his hands, peering at it in the moonlight.
It's from Boz!
He said when he saw the name etched on one wing. The message on the other wing was inscribed in Boz's sloppy handwriting, not the neater letters that appeared when he wrote mentally. It read, Morb no good. Find my old diary and show it to Palace.
That means he's alive!
Perta cried.
The Reds who disappeared are alive!
Gliss looked relieved.
We have to find them and save them!
Zan knew she was right, but it wasn't going to be easy. To find Boz's diary, they'd have to leave the safety of the Hollow and return to where Zan's house had been. Then they would need to figure out how to get to the palace in First City. And they'd have to do it all without any magic.